So thank you to everybody, as Emily said, for joining. I'm going to take you briefly through the consultation proposals. I know some of you will already have seen those. And then I'm really keen to be answering your questions after that. So I want to give you a bit of background to the consultation, talk a bit about my summary of what states members do, how I've gone about making the decisions, some of the key proposals, and then some other elements that I've covered also in the consultation before coming on to the next steps and taking your questions. So the background to the consultation, the States Assembly decided last year to put in place some new legislation, replacing the former system that was in place for determining their pay. And the real reason for this was to make sure that the decision was made completely independently. So for the first time, there's no role for the states members themselves in the decision about their own pay. So I have been appointed as the reviewer, and I am carrying out the process that's envisaged under the Act to arrive at my decision about their pay and how it should be updated in the future. And as part of that, I'm required to consult certain people. So I'm required to consult states members themselves who are clearly affected by the decisions. And I'm also required to consult the Minister for Treasury and Resources, who in his capacity is the person who has to find the money to pay. I also decided that it was important to share my proposals before there were any final decisions made with members of the public and potentially other interested parties. That's important, I think, partly to make sure that I get the full range of perspectives on this question before making the decision, and also in the interest of transparency about what's going on, because we don't always necessarily have visibility of what's happening in our Parliament, in the States Assembly. So just really important, I think, to share and have an opportunity to answer your questions while there's still time for the decision to change. So this consultation runs until the 3rd of October. I'm very much hoping that if you haven't already, that once you've heard my presentation, you will take some time to fill in the online survey and share your views on my proposals with me. So before getting to the question of pay, it's important, I think, to pause it and just reflect on what states members actually do. They're part of the Parliament in Jersey. They do an important job and they make important decisions that have an impact on everyone who lives in Jersey. So I think it's important to start from the premise that we understand what they do and we think about paying them fairly for doing that role. So in the consultation, I've described this in a bit more detail, tried to give it a bit more colour of what it's like day to day. But broadly speaking, just to summarise, I've identified some core components of the role that all states members, whether they're constables or deputies, will do. They can propose and speak on and discuss and then decide on laws. They engage with their constituents, that might be parishioners or in the multi-member constituencies for deputies, and that can be a combination of describing and discussing policy issues and also hearing about concerns and individual cases of difficulty that constituents are experiencing and thinking about how those constituents might be able to address those problems. And another core element of what those members who are not part of the government, so they're not in the Council of Ministers, can be involved in is scrutiny panels and the Public Accounts Committee, both of which hold ministers to account effectively for not only policy but also the execution and implementation of that policy and the spending of public money. And then there are some other things which the States Assembly does, which some members contribute to. So some of them are obviously one chief minister and then others, ministers and assistant ministers, who are providing the executive and deciding and implementing policy. Other committees such as the Privileges and Procedures Committee, which deals with really the internal workings of Parliament and similar matters, Planning Committee making decisions on planning applications, and then some other bodies such as Jersey's Overseas Aid and the States Employment Board, where certain members of the States Assembly serve effectively a governance function in the oversight and running of those entities. So that is a very brief necessarily, so a summary of what states members do. But it's important, I think, to think that it's an important and not straightforward job. Something that I did. So I did speak to states members in preparing this consultation, not to ask them what they thought they should be paid, but just to find out a bit more about their work and what it's like being a states member. And something that they told me, which is similar to what you hear from parliamentarians in other countries, but even more acute in a small community such as Jersey, is that this is a job which is always on. People are always being approached by their constituents in all sorts of places, both the kind of formal work setting, but also at the supermarket as they're going home, picking the children up from school. Many of them, they weren't necessarily complaining about that. People understand it's part of their job, but it is an important kind of feature of what it's like to be a states member. And it's also important to think that they cover a really wide range of tough issues. And I've been listening to both in person and online, because you can follow all the debates online, the wide range of business that the States Assembly covers. It's everything from decisions about housing, which are really important for people, to technical matters like anti-money laundering rules. There are a whole range of different and difficult issues for people to cover and understand in their brief. And so a lot of the work that they do, although the Assembly only meets in full once every 3 weeks, a lot of the work that they do is behind the scenes, preparing for those sessions, following up on issues that are discussed, or in the meetings of the scrutiny panels and other committees that I've talked about, not the stuff that is perhaps in the headlines every day. Another thing which you'll be probably well aware of, but it's different from some other countries, is that most states members are not part of a formal political party, although parties do exist, and there is, of course, a block of states members who are part of a political party at the moment. But that means that for those who are not, a lot of work is done individually and not necessarily through a party mechanism. But for all members, I'd say, and whether they're part of a political party or not, it's clear that they are subject to intense personal scrutiny. And again, I think we might agree that it's right that our parliamentarians hold themselves and are held to high standards of behaviour. I think we all probably know from our own lives that where we're subject to that kind of scrutiny in public, it can also be quite stressful. Doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. But again, I think important to remember and understand what it's like. And it really is, I think, a full-time role. And that's perhaps a bit different from how it was back in the day, both in Jersey and elsewhere, where we had people who were doing this on top of other full-time occupations. That is very difficult to do these days because of the nature of the work and the complexity of running a country such as Jersey. So, having reflected a bit on the role and wanting to understand, check that I'd understood what it involves for states members here in Jersey, I also then thought about how would I go about making decisions. And it seemed to me that there were certain principles that are worth setting out that are important here. I'd be very interested in your views on these because they've guided how I've gone about the decision-making process. So I think it's important that the remuneration should be enough to enable a wide range of candidates to seek election. Again, in Jersey, as in many other places, again, back in the day, people needed to be independently wealthy to be able to have the time to take on political roles without getting any kind of remuneration for them. That clearly would rule out a lot of people from being able to stand. So that's not the situation that we want going forward. So we want people to have a sufficient remuneration to be able to consider standing as candidates. And we want to give them a fair reward for the office that they hold, that work that they're actually doing, but while also paying a due regard to other interests, particularly taxpayers. So taxpayers, of course, ultimately funding the States Assembly and paying, providing the funds through taxation by which this remuneration is provided. And finally, or in terms of kind of this balance of interests, I think where I can and where, unless there's a very good reason to depart from it, it's useful to try to draw inspiration from and relate the decisions back to general remuneration practice, by which I mean how other people are treated in terms of their pay. And if there is a need for a different approach, I think it should be explained what that need is. I've tried to take account of international good practice, but also obviously link that to the particular situation in Jersey. And also I've tried to focus on the reward, so remuneration as a reward for carrying out our role, and not as a way of funding doing the job, so not providing the tools of the trade. It can be quite messy when these two things are put together, because it can give quite a misleading impression of both what states members are actually paid themselves, also of what resources they have available to support them in doing the job, and that is unhealthy, I think, for both the public, because it's not very clear to them kind of what their money, what the public money is being spent on, and it can be quite unhelpful also for members. So I wanted to think about this focus on remuneration and reward, and importantly, that is not only the salary. Salary is an important component, but for the last few years, states members have also been entitled to contributions towards a pension, and so I'm thinking about the overall package of remuneration, not only the salary part of it. Having said which, I'm going to come on and just talk you through the main proposals, starting with the salary, so pay, I'm calling that here. And what I've done here is I've taken some inspiration from the very good work that was done by my predecessors in the States Members Remuneration Review Board. They considered a range of international comparisons, and also looked at how states members' earnings and pay compared to other employee earnings in Jersey. And they found a couple of things. They found when they did that states members were quite low paid in terms of international comparators, and unusual also in terms of not adding on extra pay for ministerial and other responsibilities, which we'll come on and talk about a little bit later. In my thinking about pay, what I have done is I have considered that core states members role that we talked about, not ministerial or other potentially additional responsibilities that some states members may take on. And I have kept a benchmark relative to employee earnings in Jersey as a kind of indicative range within which to keep states members' earnings, which they established as the 70th and the 75th percentile of employee earnings. So that means that effectively they're kind of paid somewhere between the sort of 70th and 75th best paid people in Jersey who have an employed role. So that's people working full time who are not self-employed. Now, the thing that was tricky about following other aspects of my predecessor's approach was that what they did was that they looked ahead for the 4 years between elections and looked at how the economy was forecast to evolve during that time. And therefore set in train some updates to salaries based on those forecasts. That was a very sensible thing to do at the time, but at the time when that approach was being used, and they were very clear about this, we were in a time where the economy was quite stable and inflation was low. There was not a huge amount of change happening in the economic environment or in wages more broadly. Now, as we know, post-COVID and various other shocks, we're in a different economic situation now. We're more worried about cost of living. We've seen rises in inflation, and we've seen some more radical changes in wages and earnings. So it seemed to me that it was going to be quite high risk for the next few years to rely on the same approach that my predecessors had done. And so the proposal that I'm making here instead is that each year states members' salaries should be reassessed and revised in line with Jersey's average earnings index starting from October this year. Now, the final decision, of course, both about whether this is what happens and about when it starts, will be taken after the consultation. So don't worry that consultation ends after the 1st of October. So I've taken that approach, which is widely used, or proposing that approach, which is widely used by a number of other countries already, which have to grapple with this same problem that Jersey's facing, which is really about how do we find a way of reflecting the changes that other people are experiencing in updating states members' salaries. So a number of other jurisdictions take this approach. There are some differences as to the precise earnings index that they use. I've discussed that a little bit more in the consultation, but that's my proposal here. And just to, again, sort of elaborate on that context. So what I found when I looked at what had happened to states members' salaries over the last few years was that, and this, you'll find this table in the consultation document, if states members' salaries had kept pace with that sort of benchmark band that my predecessors described, it would have lain by last year between £51,900 and £56,600, whereas in fact it had fallen below that, and even after a pay rise that they received last summer, it still remained below the bottom of that band that the SMRRB had determined. And that's what gave me a view that it was important to start addressing that gap and bringing them back in line. Now, the average earnings index, it's published by Statistics Jersey once a year at the end of August, and it relates to data that they collect in the previous June. Now, I've got here, this is, again, you'll find this in the consultation document, and it's from Statistics Jersey. It shows you what the numbers have been, the percentage change each year back to 1991. And you will probably have seen already that this year, the average earnings number is a change of 7.7%. So it's showing how employee salaries have changed since the previous year. Now, it's really important to say that 7.7% is a high number by historical standards. It is highly unlikely to be repeated. Now, although I've said that there is a degree of uncertainty around economic forecasts at the moment, it's important to say that Jersey's panel of economic forecasters is predicting much lower figures for the years ahead. They correctly predicted that this year would be higher than last year, but they're predicting that this should be much lower. And you can see from the chart that there's a kind of cycle here, and that in many years it has been much lower. So I think it's really important to say that making this connection is not suggesting that states member salaries should be increasing by 7.7% every year. So that's all I want to say for now about pay, but obviously be happy to take your questions on that. Don't be shy about sending those in. I wanted to move on and talk about the pension. And the pension, although it was recommended some time ago, it has not been implemented until relatively recently. So the pension was not in place at the time when my predecessors did their last report. I've considered whether the pension arrangements are appropriate and whether any changes need to be made. And I should say that, again, by international standards, it was unusual that Jersey parliamentarians didn't have a pension. Their pensions are not out of line, particularly internationally. But I've been thinking here also about the context within Jersey. I've taken various factors into account here. So firstly is that the structure of remuneration seemed to me to be more like that of the public sector than the private sector. For those in private sector, particularly in other people who are in that 70th to 75th quartile or above, they may have a range of other components to their remuneration, like bonuses or other benefits that states members, like other public servants, don't get. And so it seemed to me appropriate to align at least their pension contributions to those of other public servants. They're not quite in the same actual pension scheme as the other public servants. And there's also some important, quite detailed measures, but it's important to avoid any conflicts of interest if states members were, because they have the power to do so, to decide to make changes to other public servants' pension arrangements, to make sure that wasn't taken with a view to benefiting them. So I've put some safeguards in there about effectively not mirroring in their own pension any beneficial changes that they make that do apply to other public servants. But I am proposing to increase the contribution that they get from the public purse, which is analogous to an employer contribution, from 10% of their salary to 16%. Again, from the 1st of October of this year. And that is just bringing them into line with the percentage of salary which other public servants currently already receive. So really just aligning them to that experience. So that's the main proposal on the pension. Now, there isn't much else in terms of remuneration that people get for doing the job, because, as I've said, those are the two components. But there is a special situation that arises at the end of the parliamentary term, when people, of course, may choose not to stand again for election. But where they do stand again, of course, not everybody will win. Some people will lose their seats. And this was something where a new way of dealing with that was put in place in 2022, and I was asked in particular by the Privileges and Procedures Committee to look again at whether that approach needed any adjustments. Privileges and Procedures Committee didn't give me any steer about what they thought the answer should be, quite rightly, but just asked me to think about that, which they have power to do under the legislation. So the issue here is what's the right comparator to take for people who are effectively coming to the end of what you might consider to be a fixed term contract. And if they stand down, arguably that's their choice. Arguably that's something where it's not evident that they should be compensated for choosing to do something else. Whereas if they stand again, they won't know until the election comes in what the electorate has decided to do, and it wasn't their choice to leave. So the approach that was put in place previously started to work towards looking at how the redundancy framework that's in place in Jersey for other people might be adapted and applied to states members. And I am keeping that thought process and building on that approach, but I am suggesting some changes to how the amounts are calculated, and also who is going to be eligible. And for reasons that I'll explain to you, I have come up with two proposals. One is for the next election, which takes place in 2026, and one is for the elections that take place after that. And the two issues that I've thought about, so first is, as I've said, this issue about being fair to people that are departing in line with other workers. But the other thing that I wanted to take into account is the fact that one downside of where we only give these payments to people that choose to stand for election is that there, of course, is then a financial incentive for people to stand for election without actually wanting to win. And of course, that's not good either for the individuals themselves, but perhaps more importantly for the electorate, who may turn out to have a wasted vote. So my conclusion about how to deal with this is that for the next election, the amount should remain as they are now, partly because people who made a decision about whether to stand had in mind that what the payments would be and who would be eligible for them. But for a small group of the longest serving members, I am proposing to give them eligibility for those payments, even if they do not stand again. So these are just for people who, at the start of 2026, the year in which the next election is due to be held, will have more than 19 years continuous service in their most recent period of service. And I should say that one factor that I've taken into account there is the fact that, unlike many other public servants, until very recently, there was no pension provision, for example. So there have been, those longest serving members have had less access to certain forms of remuneration than other public servants. Now, after that 2026 election, which is a transitional, I'm not suggesting that approach is continued. After that, we'll revert to the same approach, which is that only those who stand again will be eligible. So this is a one-off opportunity, and I'm proposing then a new basis for the amounts, which I'll just go on and explain. So effectively here there is, again, I'm drawing on Jersey's statutory redundancy framework, but rather than paying redundancy which is linked to the entirety of a states member service, so if they've been a states member for the last 20 years, I wouldn't be calculating using that length of time to calculate the amount that they'd be due. I'd be resetting at each 4-year election. So at each election, I would be deeming that they would have a decision at that point about whether to stand again, and if they did, their sort of period for which they would be being compensated on loss of office would reset to the last election. But what I am proposing to do is to add on a month, which is analogous to a month's notice, because if you lose an election and you really have about 4 days, as of the 2022 election anyway, before the winners are sworn in, and you're then an ex-states member. So it's a very short notice period for people. And that makes it obviously very difficult to deal with having lost your role. So the proposal after the next election would be that we would have a change and the calculation would be made on the basis of 1 month's salary per continuous year of service, but up to a maximum of 4 years, plus this 1 month's notice. Of service, but lower amounts for those with a longer term of service. So that's the loss of office payments. There are some other proposals which are set out in the paper and which may form part of my final determination. So the determination is the part of my final report which I am the final decision maker for, and which the states members can't change. I can also make some recommendations about things which I'm not the final decision maker for, and I'll come on to those in a moment. So my other proposals, there are some about providing information about the transition to becoming a states member for candidates and for those who are new, because quite a lot of things change about people's finances at that time, and it can be quite a difficult and uncertain period, particularly if you don't have information about how states members' remuneration works. I am proposing to require states members to accept their full salary, not give them the option to decline. And that's really to just avoid having effectively a circumvention of this process by having political or public pressure put on people not to accept a salary which the Remuneration Reviewer has determined is the right one for them. So I want to make that explicit just to avoid that problem arising. I am proposing proposals to include in the determination that there should be more effort made to encourage states members to take up the pension that's available to them. States members, like many of us, are not. Well, there's no reason why they should be pensions experts. Sometimes we also put off making decisions about our futures. So I think it is important to ensure that there is information and support available to states members to enable them to take up that benefit. Now, here's something which has caused, I think, a little bit of confusion in the consultation responses that I've received so far. So I just want to explain this quite carefully. One of the things that I pointed out in the consultation is that obviously the overall cost to the taxpayer of paying states members' remuneration comes both from what we pay each individual, but also how many of those individuals there are. And I have assumed in making my proposals that there are 49, which is the current number of states members. But I wanted to think about what would happen if, because I'm not the decision maker for how many states members there are, that number were to change. And the slight confusion that I just want to dispel is I'm not proposing myself that there should be, or whether there should be, any change to the size of the States Assembly. It's a matter that the States Assembly itself would decide. But I do think it's important to think about what should happen in terms of individual salaries if the size of the Assembly changes, just given the changing burden that would mean for taxpayers. So I'm considering, really just as a kind of safeguard, that I should specify in my determination that if the size of the Assembly were to increase, there should be a proportionate decrease in the pay per member. That's really not as a recommendation or suggestion that the size of the Assembly should increase. It's just as a kind of safeguard to protect the taxpayer interest if that decision were to be taken. And I'm also seeking views on whether that should be effectively symmetrical, such that if the States Assembly did decide to reduce its numbers, which is something that has been proposed in Jersey in the past. There's been proposals specifically to reduce to 42 members. There should be some process for reallocating at least some of that saving towards individual salaries. I'm very keen to get views from you about that. It relates to the question of whether that fundamental positioning of salaries between the 70th and 75th percentile of Jersey employees is the right one, and whether there would be scope or desire to change that if there were more funding available. And then there's finally, I've asked a quite sort of technical question, which is just about how to make sure that the way that the decision is crafted doesn't create any oddities if the timing of the next election reverts from June to May, and so it's not complete years after the last one. So as you can see, a slightly techie question, and I recognise that many people may feel that they don't have much to add on that, but for anyone who does, I'm very grateful to hear from you. Other recommendations. So these are matters which are not for me to decide, but I think that there is a remuneration aspect to these issues, and so, as such, I have proposed to include reference to them in my final report as matters for the states' assemblies to reflect on and to decide how it wants to whether or how it wants to take these forward. The first is about considering making participation in those scrutiny panels or the Public Accounts Committee compulsory for all non-ministers. At the moment, not everybody who is eligible to do so does participate in those, though they may do other roles in Parliament. I think that makes it harder both for the Assembly itself to fulfil its important public functions, and also for the public to have clarity about what the core role is of a states member that effectively this remuneration is going towards securing for them. So I think there would be some benefits in making that participation compulsory. Also, although at the moment the legislation does not allow for any differentiation in pay, and so I haven't considered kind of what that differentiation might be or any amounts, but I do think it would be beneficial to amend the legislation such that it would allow for additional pay for ministers and for this to be within the to be done before the next remuneration review. Jersey is the only country among many comparisons looked at by my predecessors which didn't pay any additional salary to ministers. So it really is, by international standards, a very acute outlier. And then again, a slightly technical but important point is that there is at least a perception of a conflict of interest, which could arise from the fact that the State's Employment Board, which is the legal entity that employs all pretty much all employees of the states in the public sector, consists only of states members, both members of the Council of Ministers and some who are not. I think it would be better to have some external members because it means that, again, it reduces the chance of a kind of feed through for any benefits that are decided for other members of the public sector being done with a view to enhancing states members' own remuneration. And I note that this is something which the Controller and Auditor General in Jersey has also recommended for slightly different reasons. So I think there would be some potential benefits there. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of my key proposals and some other recommendations. In terms of the consultation runs until the 3rd of October, so please do respond. I'm aiming to finalise my determination as quickly as I can. I'm reading the responses as they come in and looking to make decisions quite promptly once I've reflected on the consultation responses. I will be publishing, obviously, my final decisions and any recommendations. And you'll see that there's also an option in the survey when you fill it in, if you would like us to email you, so you don't have to go looking for it with the findings from review, we'll be happy to do that. So thank you very much. That's all I wanted to share in the presentation. And I've seen, thank you, that questions have started to come in. So I'm going to start working my way through some of the questions there, but please don't be shy if you want to add any in. So the first question is about international good practice, and what's appropriate for remuneration of elected members. Which countries have I been considering? So I've actually considered a very wide range. Some me personally, and some drawing on work that's done by my predecessors. And it's slightly different for different elements of the proposals. But you'll see that there are examples and comparators from Guernsey to Singapore to Wales to the UK to Germany, all discussed in different parts of the consultation. And so I think two things that are important there in terms of thinking about comparators. You can't very easily compare cash amounts because different countries have different economic kind of contexts, and that is not my predecessors, who did a huge amount of work looking at pay levels in different countries for parliamentarians and how they compared. They avoided that by looking at how the pay of parliamentarians in each country compared to the minimum wage and median earnings in that country. So there are ways around the kind of difficulty of comparing between jurisdictions. The second thing to say is that clearly it is important to think about, I'd say, kind of small and large jurisdictions. You see some different practices and patterns there. Something that I think is seen in a range of both large and small jurisdictions is this linking to a statistical benchmark. Sometimes the size of the jurisdiction and the particular characteristics inform the choice of which earnings benchmark is used, but that is something which has emerged as a fairly common practice in a range of countries, large and small. So thank you very much for that question. And a next question, which is about also pay, is about how salaries can be linked to performance. So there's a question about whether and how we could link elected members' performance, pay to performance. Again, this is something which a number of jurisdictions have grappled with, but there is not there's not a clear basis for linking pay and performance for states members. It's really it reflects the fact that parliamentarians, as elected representatives, their role is to, and their kind of account is to represent their constituents, and they're accountable to their constituents through the election process, which is a fairly direct and, you might say, even brutal form of performance review. But it's very difficult to link pay to performance, and certainly to do that on an individual basis, for example, and particularly in a context where it's very difficult to attribute contribution of individual members in that way. So I don't think that that's something which I'm going to be able to take forward here, and it's not something which has, although it's been kind of considered and understandably is an appealing way of approaching the question. It's very difficult to implement for this kind of role. Then I've got a question which is about the how I have taken into account the fact that the States Assembly is mostly made up of elected members that are not aligned to a political party. So I think I don't think that there's kind of a cash amount, if I can put it that way. I think the main thing is in thinking about here, making sure that I have thought about the context of how the States Assembly works, and rather than making assumptions about how the States Assembly works based on the experience of other parliaments that may work differently. So part of this is really just thinking a bit about making sure that I've understood the whole workings of the States Assembly. One thing that is important, I think, in a Jersey context to note, and it's not something that I have made recommendations on, but I think it's important for the public to be aware, is that the States Assembly members here don't receive a huge amount, whether members of a party or not, they don't receive a huge amount of backing in terms of support and resources, for example, for their own staff. They don't receive any secretarial or administrative assistance. Of course, there are some kind of central functions in the state's graph, for example, but they are not hugely resourced and so I think it's kind of important just to be clear that what you might see in some other jurisdictions is both that the parliamentarians would have an individual office and staff and a lot of kind of support behind them. They would also potentially have access to additional resources that were provided by their political party. And I think it's just important to reflect when we're thinking about, particularly, you know, some people understandably kind of concerned about paying parliamentarians more money. And I just want to kind of reassure those people that I think that they're being, you know, the recommendations here are fair in terms of the work that they do. They're also not costing you, the taxpayer, a huge amount in other ways, because they're not receiving huge amounts of other resources to help them do their job. I've had a question, the next question, which is about some of the specific proposals. So I will go back and check that I've got the right proposals and ask whether these proposals are democratic, is the question, and then you'll let me know if I'm responding to the right proposal. So I think it's about proposal 2 and proposal 4. So proposal 2 is about requiring states members to accept their full salary, and the question is this democratic? So I think this is it is done in some other jurisdictions for similar reasons, and I would say that this is one of the special aspects of thinking about elected politicians' pay, because they are under extreme public scrutiny, and it is a very easy way to make political capital to ask individuals not to accept their pay rise, which is kind of immediately an attractive response, but can really undermine the impact of work like this, which is seeking to take a fair and objective view of what they should be paid. So I think that is an entirely reasonable approach to take. The other question, again, is it democratic? So this is about options 4 and 5, and so I think this is where the clarification that I tried to make is important. I certainly don't think it would be democratic for me to make decisions as a remuneration reviewer about the size of the State's Assembly. There are a whole range of other factors which should inform that decision, and it should not be one that's taken by me. But I do think it's important to reflect on the fact that if there is an increase in the size of the Assembly, I think it does need to be reconsidered about whether the role, in fact, is different. The number of Jersey inhabitants isn't necessarily changing, so it's kind of worth thinking about. Has the role changed? And I think it's also worth kind of reflecting on the fact that there can't really, I would argue, be kind of I don't know, an open check, a blank check to the taxpayer to keep funding a States Assembly of any size. So I think it is important that States members consider the cost impact before making any decision about increase. And I also think that the trend in the States Assembly has been towards a reduction. The States Assembly is slightly larger than would be implied by international comparisons, particularly with smaller jurisdictions. So I think this is, as I say, a kind of disciplining effect just to take account of the financial implications of something which, quite rightly, is not for me to take a decision on. But I'd be very interested to hear, obviously, the views of people asking the question and others in the consultation response before making a final decision on that point. So I've had a question here about whether States members have had any input to my work and any influence. And I'm grateful to the questioner for separating those two things, because I think they have had input, which I'll explain in a moment, without really having influence. So I wanted to and asked to have a dialogue with states members to explain to them how I was proposing to go about this review. I have done that. That I think is good practice in any situation where you're communicating with pay or about people's pay, what they're going to be paid for doing a job. I don't think any of us who have been employed would take very kindly to just hearing, from the press, for example, about what we were going to be paid. So I think that was an important thing to do. And I also asked and did spend time with states members, asking them questions about their work and their role, what they do, how they do it. Not hearing from them or asking them about what they thought they should be paid. I did not provide them with any access before publication to my proposals. I didn't think that was appropriate. They had them at the same time. I briefed members in person, but they had them only once they were published to the press and the public. And again, that's to make it really clear to everybody, I hope, that I'm making decisions independently and there's no opportunity behind closed doors to change my decision, but there is an open and transparent process for providing input, and I will reflect on all of that before reaching a view. So thank you very much for that question. I'm just sort of scrolling down again through the questions. So there's a question about what's the likelihood of my other recommendations, such as having to work in scrutiny, being taken forward and being implemented. Well, that's a good question. I don't know is the short answer. But what I would say is I thought it was part of my responsibility in doing this role to flag things which I thought were merited attention. But again, where I think quite properly it would not be me that should be the decision maker. My sense is that the States has been very reflective over the last 10 years or so about changes to their composition, working methods. And so I'm sure that process of reflection will continue. Quite rightly, it's not for me to predict the outcome of that, but really just to make some suggestions for further consideration. And the final question that I can see at the moment, so if there are any others, please do get them in now, because we'll otherwise probably draw to a close after this next question. So there's a question about would I describe some elected members as career politicians, and could that result from possibly high remuneration? It's really interesting, isn't it? So I think we don't in other fields think about people who have a career in a particular field as that necessarily being a bad thing. I think perhaps it can have that connotation in relation to our politicians. I think what we see in the States Assembly, as in many other parliaments, is a real mix of people that come in and serve a term or two, some that have been there for a long working career. And I think you can probably argue both ways in terms of the impact of remuneration. I think the real challenge is if we don't remunerate people fairly for doing an important job, we won't get people to stand to do it at all. And that's not in the interests of the electorate in Jersey. We have had in the past situations in Jersey where there've been a number of seats where there was no contest for the election. That's not an ideal situation either. So we want people not just enough to fill an assembly, but enough to come forward as candidates so that the electorate can reflect and choose those they think are most appropriate. And I do think that it's never that palatable to contemplate a raise in salary for our politicians, but it is important that we give them a fair salary, and that people who are thinking about whether they've got a contribution to make to Jersey through the States Assembly don't feel deterred from standing because of the remuneration that we're offering. So that brings me to the end of the questions that I've received here. I'd like to thank you all very much for attending. I'd like to thank everybody for the questions. I would also finally like to thank the excellent communications team at the States Assembly, GREF, so Emily and Charlotte and others who have helped me to put this webinar together. I'd encourage you to reply to the consultation by the 3rd of October and look forward very much to hearing your views. Thank you very much.